your battle for 35 years before all of these advancements.
Well, when I had my heart attack in 1978, my first one, most of the things that saved my life and that have kept me alive over the years didn't even exist, hadn't been invented yet. And crucial breakthroughs like cholesterol-lowering drugs,
right,
and implantable defibrillator and stents, and an LVAD, a left ventricular assist device, all of that was developed after that first heart attack. The story of what we try to do in the book is tell my case as a way of talking about all of those innovations.
Yeah.
I had the invitation, a couple of years ago, the Cleveland Clinic called, said we're having a big conference on medical innovation and cardiology, and we got suppliers coming and docs coming. We decided we needed a patient. And we decided
the poster child.
Yeah, a good one.
And they said, you've had virtually everything done to you can do to a heart patient. Would you be our patient? So they sent the plane down, and I spent an afternoon, my doctor and I, with that group up to Cleveland Clinic talking about my case by way of just demonstrating what had happened and how it all worked.
Now, by the way, he looks so much better than the last. I hate to sound like a relative that saw you Thanksgiving. You look so
like
much
weight and a little rosiness in the cheeks
than you did the last time you were here.
Oh, my Lord, yeah.
And
Nancy, these innovations that we're looking at, I mean, I know from my own personal experience in my family, my mom has a stent. It's not like they just keep people on life support or barely. You go on with your life.
Well, that's the whole point. So there's
amazing.
longevity of life and there's quality of life. And I think the vice president came to the point where both were threatened.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, and I'm not touting any one company, but Medtronic has always been sort of an innovator in all of these implantable devices, and I have sort of made jokes at the vice president's expense that, Medtronic, if you ever wanted to see, a company maybe worth investing in, I have no stock or investment in Medtronic.
It sounds like you do.
No, I do not. But I've been in the halls of their building and have seen all their innovations, and I know how extraordinary they have led in this field, and the vice president is certainly the recipient of a lot of their brain power.
One of their devices saved my life.
Yes.
Which one?
What do you got?
Implantable defibrillator.
Okay.
I went into sudden cardiac arrest, and it read my heart rate at 222 beats per minute, gave me a shock 16 seconds from the time when I went out till I was back.
And that's the wireless technology of knowing he was in trouble and taking care of it through central data. So that is sort of a woo-woo, extraordinary exchange of information where the patient allows that information to be transported to somewhere else. Someone says, patient's in trouble, boom. And he literally got his chest.
It's the kind of device, if Tim Russert had, he'd be with us today.
Yeah. When did you have this happen to you?
That was December of 2009, about a year after we left the White House. Back in my car out of the garage out in Jackson, and I blacked out. Car went up on top of the rock at the end of the driveway, and I came back 16 seconds later, and all I had was a bump on my head.
Any fears? Were there any national security fears that when you had something implanted? I mean, it's seen straight out of Homeland, actually.
That's right.
Any fears, and what precautions did you guys take?
Well, when we put it in originally in 2001, then we got a newer model in about 2007, and we put it in. And that newer model was capable of being programmed remotely, wirelessly. And we removed that feature out of a concern that if I was working a rope line someplace or in a crowd, that somebody could, in fact, tamper with that device and cause a heart attack. And so we disabled that feature. And then some years later on Homeland, they actually had an episode where somebody did exactly that, killed the vice president who had an implantable defibrillator.
It's incredible because
What do you think about that scene? I saw him start to smirk, Will. He was like, we do lots of luck.
Well, it seems, you watch
Watch
that scene, it looks so far-fetched. And then you hear the vice president say it was something they were actually concerned about. It's incredible. You write in the book about a point in 2010 when, frankly, you were ready to go. You were so close to death that you talked to your family members. You talked about your wishes to be cremated. Take me inside, if you would, that moment of having to sit down with your family and say, I believe I've reached the end.
Well, in that 17-month period after I left the White House, there was steady downhill progression that culminated in July of 2010 with end-stage heart failure. My heart was no longer moving enough blood to service my kidneys, my liver, and my other vital organs, and I had best days to live. I thought we'd run out of the technology and so forth, and I expressed my wishes to the family. As I write in the book, it was death was imminent. But it was not frightening. It was a peace. I'd been anticipating for a long time that sooner or later the technology would run out and that I would face that situation and die of heart disease. And this was the moment. And then they came up with the LVAD, the left ventricular assist device. We did that. It was a 9-hour operation.
And that's when we all saw you publicly and gasped because you were so thin.
I'd lost 40 pounds when they did that. I was in the operating room 9 hours, over 20 units of blood, caught pneumonia while I was in the recovery process, on a respirator for many, many days, sedated. And when I came out from under that, I looked exactly like my dad did. When he was 84, just before he died of heart disease.
Right.
That was the bottom. And then the LVAD, 35 weeks of rehab, and the LVAD itself, assisting the heart, got me back to the point where 20 months later I could get a transplant.
It doesn't end there. We'll talk about that now. We have a portion of your interview with 60 Minutes showing the before and after images of your heart. And just a warning, it could be difficult for some to see, but it's really important in terms of what we're learning about patients like you. Take a look.
This is an image of Cheney's ravaged and diseased heart just moments after it was removed.
This is a rather large basin, and here is your heart.
It's one I lived with for 70 years.
Normal heart would basically be about the size of 2 fists clamped together like this, maybe even a little bit smaller.
Right.
And you see this is about half a foot wide.
Old heart, new heart. Old heart, new heart. And it's one of those situations where bigger is not necessarily better.
That is amazing. Nancy.
Well, I have a question for the Vice President. You talk about your daddy and that day when you looked in the mirror and saw him. Yourself, you met him. What do you talk about the kids with regard to the genetics of heart disease and how they have to take care of themselves?
We watch very carefully. They keep track of cholesterol levels. Nobody's ever had bad habits of smoking, which I did for 20 years, and you become very conscious and aware of it inside the family, and nobody else has had a problem up to this point. Of course, our daughters are in their 40s, and we've got 7 grandchildren, but it'll be something you need to watch, but we get better and better at it all the time. And one of the miracle things that happened to me was cholesterol-lowering drugs. That really, when I did my quadruple bypass 10 years after my first heart attack, the bypass was important, but the cholesterol-lowering drugs came in at the same time, and that was even more important.
I think the family is so interesting for perhaps genetic profiling and just studying the genetics of everybody, because you and Mrs. Cheney are alive, you have children and grandchildren, and starting to look for cardiac markers that may be genetic switches that you could turn on or off with behavior would be very, very interesting.
There's another remarkable scene in the book on September 11th, 2001, of all days. You get the news that you're at very serious risk of a heart attack. When did you hear that news, and how did you handle it in that moment?
I actually didn't know about it till afterwards.
Oh, you didn't know?
Yeah, and it was a false alarm. But they'd done blood work that morning, which I did periodically anyway, and then that was before the attack. Then the attack totally disrupted the process by which they'd send that blood sample out to Bethesda and evaluate it. And what came back was a reading that my potassium level was very high and could cause a heart attack. Turned out it was a false reading, but I didn't know about it that evening. And there's a picture on the back of that first book I wrote of the doctor handing me a document that shows that they need another blood sample. And I told him, no, we'll do that in the morning. It turned out it wasn't a problem, but the docs were obviously very worried. That
I'm a little busy here, guys. You know.
We do want to.
And we sit here and complain that we don't have time to go get checked. Really. Yeah, I'm trying to hold the world together
now,
here.
Joe. Yeah. We want to ask you about the Republican Party, but I'm just curious. And I watched the 60 Minutes interview, and there's all sorts of questions about your ability to make decisions and this and that. And were you all there? I'd like to take.
Were you incensed by those questions?
No,
I wasn't surprised by them.
I'd like to take a different angle to it and ask you how the experience of being near death so many times, or living with the possibility of death and depending on innovation to get you through the next day, week, month, year, how that did impact your decisions, your outlook, your values when it came to facing times of war and life and death crises for our country.
Well, there was a key moment when I had my first heart attack. I'm in the middle of my first campaign for Congress, 3 months before the primary, 37 years old, and I asked my doctor, he's a great guy, Cheyenne, Wyoming, named Rick Davis. There were no cardiologists in Wyoming those days. I said, Rick, am I going to have to give up my campaign? And he said, oh, hell, Dick, hard work never killed anybody. That was his response. Now,
oh, how Wyoming.
Wyoming. Now, admittedly, I heard what I wanted to hear. Yeah. He also said, you know, what'll kill you, what causes stress, is spending your life doing something you don't want to be doing. Yeah. But I lived by that. Hard work never killed anybody. And I love my jobs. I couldn't wait to get back. And every time I went through one of these incidents, I dealt with it, and then I went back to work. First heart attack, quit smoking, you know, so watch your diet. It's time to get a cholesterol lowering drug, you take it. I always tried to separate out the job from my health, never used the job to avoid dealing with a problem. And my doc said I had something to do, but never used the job to I kept it separate, I guess is the way I think about it. I didn't go through life wringing my hands saying, gee, when am I going to have the next heart attack? I had incidents I had to deal with, and I dealt with them. You can live with chronic heart disease. That's part of what this book is all about, that the technology's gotten so good that there's no reason why, depending upon your condition, obviously, why you can't go on with a normal life, and I did.
So we had Peter Baker here last week, who's written a book that makes a lot of Bush-Cheney staffers twitch. Mm-hmm. I think Nicole said she had post-traumatic stress.
She was twitching.
She was twitching, and I've heard the same from a lot of other people who worked in that administration. A great book. But I asked him, I said, what about these stories where, you know, Brent Scowcroft saying, you know, a friend of the Brzezinskis and
me.
And you, a good guy, but saying, I don't know Dick Cheney anymore, and suddenly everybody rushed in and said it's because he had a heart attack and that changed him. I always thought that was nonsense. A lot of people don't. But Peter Baker, I asked him, and he said, no, he didn't. All of the research and all of the conclusion, he came to the same conclusion. But what is your answer to those who still say, well, he had a heart attack and it changed him, and the Dick Cheney that we loved and adored on September 10th, 2001 became a monster on Darth Vader on September 12th, 2001?
Well, that had a lot more to do with September 11th than it did with my medical history. After I had my third heart attack and quadruple coronary bypass surgery and cholesterol-lowering drugs, Dr. Alan Ross, who was then head of cardiology at GW, was my doctor, wrote a letter to the Senate Armed Services Committee as part of my confirmation as Secretary of Defense. And it's a very good letter. It's in the book. Basically says there's no reason in the world why he is not capable of performing at the highest level. There's nothing he's taking by way of medications or anything else that should in any way interfere with his capacity to do the job. What happened was 9/11. I was in the bunker on 9/11 when they blew up the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon would have hit the White House or the Capitol building if it hadn't been for the people on Flight 93. And we were at war. And I was having to make decisions and work with the president and everybody else involved. And that would have been would have affected anybody's look at the kind of threat we faced with. Before that,
did it narrow your focus, though, even more, as Mika was asking, how being close to death and knowing, did it narrow your focus in a way where you weren't worried about what everybody was saying about you? You were just focused on
partly what was symbolically about what had happened before, what had a big impact that morning, was back in the 80s, I had been part of a program that was then classified, I think part of it still is, that focused on what do we do if we have an all-out global nuclear